And Zeus, the father, made a race of bronze, sprung from the ash tree, worse than the silver race, but strange and full of power. And they loved the groans and violence of war. They ate no bread, their hearts were flinty hard. They were terrible men, their strength was great, their arms and shoulders and their limbs invincible. Their weapons were of bronze, their houses bronze. Their tools were bronze, black iron was not known. They died by their own hands, and nameless, went to Hades' chilly house. Although they were great soldiers, they were captured by Black Death, and they left the shining brightness of the sun. Taken from Hesiod's Work and Days. Hello, I'm Mark Selleck, and welcome back to Casting Through Ancient Greece, Episode 5, Collapse of the Bronze Age. Last time we focused on the Bronze Age civilization of the Myceneans, looking at what traditional tales such as the Iliad and archaeology could tell us about them. As we saw, there is not a very clear picture or narrative of their history. Everything has to be interpreted from the evidence available. This time around, we are going to look into the collapse of the Myceneans civilization. And no surprises here, but it is just as difficult to work out a clear narrative of events as the Bronze Age was coming to a close. The collapse of the Myceneans also fits into a larger collapse of the ancient world, with other great Bronze Age civilizations such as the Hittites and Old Kingdom Egypt also succumbing to events. It seems more fitting to talk about the Myceneans' downfall in a separate episode, where we can also look at the general collapse of the Bronze Age. This way we can expand on some of the theories that have been presented which try and explain what was happening. We are going to look at what evidence shows us of some interesting changes in the Mycenean civilization just before the collapse and how they were preparing for a time of change. Then we can turn to what archaeology was showing us when looking at the destructions that hit many of the places across Greece. Many theories have been put forward to explain the reasons behind the collapse, so we will have a look at what was proposed in each of them. We will then see what was happening in the world around the Myceneans at the same time, and how a similar pattern was taking place elsewhere. This will then take us up to a point in the Mediterranean world where historians class the Bronze Age as coming to an end and the onset of the Iron Age. In areas like Greece, this period would also be known as the Dark Ages. Let's start off this episode by looking at some of the changes that were occurring in the Mycenean world. Around 1200 BC, a level of unrest and reactionary behaviour starts to make itself known in the archaeological record in the Mycenean world. The first signs that something was afoot was that a number of buildings in localised areas near the larger palaces had been destroyed. Alone this doesn't seem significant, but knowing what was to happen, it shows the beginning of a time of troubles. At many of the palaces, there are signs of additional fortifications being built or added to existing ones. At Mycenean Tiryns, the fortress walls were greatly increased to protect a larger area around the bigger structures. Mycenae shows evidence of defensive preparations, as if it was expecting to be besieged by a hostile force. Fortifications were built in a way so that the defenders at Mycenae could more effectively attack an enemy at their walls. With sally ports constructed into the new walls, the warriors could deploy out to meet the enemy without compromising the protection the walls provided the city. At Mycenae, Tiryns, and Athens, steps had also been taken to secure a constant supply of water behind their defensive walls. These new constructions were out of character to what had been seen at these locations centuries before, and seemed suggestive of an extended period of war or the prospect of being besieged was ever present. Evidence of a possible defensive wall has also been discovered to have existed across the Isthmus of Corinth, the narrow stretch of land connecting the Peloponnese to the rest of Greece. Perhaps an attempt to stop hostile forces or refugees moving south into the Peloponnese. The interruption of trade was also another sign that things in the Mycenean world were changing. Some of the most notable evidence shows that problems of supply and demand were making themselves known, especially on the routes heading east. Cyprus was an important trading hub connecting the east to west. The evidence shows that it was becoming difficult to import Mycenean pictorial vases, and imitations were now being produced to supply demand. The Linear B tablets from the Myceneans themselves also show that a level of rationing had been taking place. Among a cache of tablets found at Pylos, located on the west coast of the Peloponnese, some tablets were found that carefully record metals being rationed out. Though it is hard to determine how out of the ordinary that this was, due to records only having been kept for 1 year. Also, it can't be ascertained if the rationing was due to factors affecting the sea routes, land routes, or even regional areas due to large amounts of copper being sourced from Lorien and Attica. A possible more telling piece of evidence of uncertain times also exists in the Pylos Linear B tablets. Pylos was on the west coast of the Peloponnese, with its eastern land approaches being well protected by the geography, but it would have been a lot more vulnerable from the sea. In a series of tablets titled, "Thus the Watchers are Guarding the Coastal Regions," they described how 800 men are sent to the coast and spread out in 10-man teams to act of what seems to be an early warning system to the palace. Again, since we only have the last year of Pylos' tablets, we are not sure if this was a regular system or in response to a particular threat, though the Palace of Pylos would be destroyed in the same year these tablets were kept. Although we can see a change in the behaviour of the Mycenean world, whether it be in defensive structures or actions, securing access to resources and careful rationing, the archaeological record shows us that whatever the threat they were trying to avoid would be to no avail. Around 1200 BC, a pattern of destruction set in, destroying the palaces across the Mycenean world. In the Argolid, the region where Mycenae exerted control, the evidence shows multiple destructions taking place at the Palace of Mycenae and Tiryns over a roughly 70-year period. Nearby at Medea, a single destruction event seems to have destroyed the site, though in the destruction layers at all of these sites there is evidence of intense fire. The record also shows a level of rebuilding in all of the sites afterwards and reoccupation, though not to the same level as before the destructions. Elsewhere in the region, at smaller settlements, signs of destruction and abandonment of settlements are also present. Further west on the Peloponnese, Pylos suffered the same fate, with the Linear B tablets found there helping us arrive at a date of 1190 BC as the approximate date of their destruction. Two other settlements nearby were also destroyed, but no bodies were found among the ruins, perhaps showing the watchers on the coast had succeeded in providing enough warning to the palace of an invasion. There is also a level of rebuilding in the region and reoccupation, but again on a much smaller scale. Outside of the Peloponnese, further north in the region of Boeotia, the same story is repeated at the Cadmean of Thebes, the name given to the palace after the mythical founder. Thebes and the surrounding settlements were also destroyed around the 1200 BC period, and also show modest levels of rebuilding and reoccupation. Although a large-scale picture of destruction shows itself all throughout the Mycenean world, around 1200 BC, some sites that were of lesser importance during the Mycenean times seem to have escaped the destructions and even went on to prosper in the next century. In Attica, at the Acropolis of Athens, which would become one of the most important cities in Greek civilization, no evidence has been found of any destruction or abandonment during the collapse of the Mycenean world. The later Greeks of the 5th and 4th century BC would be proud of the fact that they were unique in their situation and had not been forced out of their land, with many areas of culture relaying the idea of the Athenians being sprung from the soil. As we see here, apart from a few exceptions, the Mycenean world had suffered catastrophic destructions simultaneously in a short period of time, which has been supported in the archaeological record. But what isn't so clear is why the Mycenean world fell so catastrophically. A number of theories have been debated as to what caused the collapse, which we will have a look at in 4 different groups. These include invasion from foreigners, internal strife, natural disasters, and a system of collapse. We will start with the theories on invasion into the Mycenean world. Invasion has been a popular theory due to the large-scale destruction and intense fires that have been seen in the evidence. But who invaded and where did they come from? The first and longest enduring theory is one that is pointed to from classical times, which points to a people known as the Dorians coming from the north and overwhelming the Mycenean regions. Proponents of this theory point to these classical writers' accounts and how they refer to Dorians in the context of movements of population. Though a myth that is often tied up with the classical writers is the return of the Heraclidae, a term which is used to describe the descendants of the hero Heracles. These are supposedly to have returned to the Peloponnese, where they ruled over the regions of Mycenae, Sparta, and Argos. Though the use of the word return seems to show that the myth refers to a group of people who were indigenous and not from a foreign land. Another element pointed to support the Dorian theory is the absence of Doric dialect in Linear B tablets during the Mycenaean times. Though according to tradition, the Dorians were meant to have introduced the Greek language, but we have seen with the decipherment of Linear B, an earlier form of Greek was already in use. It has been suggested that the dialect in the tablets were of the ruling class, and Doric was a dialect of the lower class, which wouldn't be present in palace documents. A new form of pottery was also noticed as being made locally after the destructions, which is known as rutterware. This was also seen as evidence of an outside people gaining control. Though if the Dorians had brought a new pottery style with them, we would expect to see a sudden replacement and a large-scale production of it, but the evidence shows a very gradual increase in its use. Lastly, the increase in the popularity of the Sisgrave has been seen occurring just before and after the wave of destructions, and has sometimes been used to support the invasion theory. It seems more likely though that during a time of great disruption, communities would have favoured the Sisgrave, as it was far simpler and cheaper than the shaft and thalos tombs that were common during the height of the Mycenean period. Overall, it doesn't seem likely that a large marauding population known as the Dorians swept through the Mycenean world replacing them. If this was the case, probably the most telling sign would have been a sudden and noticeable change in culture. But the archaeological record doesn't show any of this at this stage. And until a distinct picture of change can be found, other reasons need to be considered for the collapse. The next theory of invasion centres around a group of people that we can imagine the Watchers of Pylos were on the lookout for. These people are known to us through the Egyptian records, who they call the Sea People. This theory has been put forward due to the problem that we just spoke of, that there is yet to be any sign of a cultural change right after the destructions. It is thought that the Sea Peoples were marauding bands that wouldn't leave any trace of their culture as they raided settlements and wouldn't stay long enough to leave any trace of themselves. Though archaeological evidence has shown that throughout the Mediterranean world, a series of conflicts from raiding forces can be seen, but not a single united group operating in a single wave. This supports what has been found in the Egyptian records, where the makeup of the Sea Peoples has been listed as incorporating many different groups, with the Myceneans also being one. The Sea Peoples are supposed to have attacked from the sea, and most raiding forces tend to focus on coastal settlements. But most of the palaces and settlements that lay in the interior were also destroyed. It seems more likely that the Sea Peoples resulted from other catastrophic events in the northern Mediterranean, which resulted in waves of displaced people that filtered down towards Egypt, the Levant, and Anatolia, which the Myceneans would become part of. They don't appear to be the cause of the collapse of the Myceneans, but resulted from the collapse in Greece and areas nearby. So if it seems unlikely that the Myceneans were in a state of collapse from outside invaders, what else could explain the widespread destruction? Perhaps if not an outside enemy, maybe an internal one. The next theory we can have a look at to explain the collapse is the one of internal strife, though there isn't much archaeological evidence that directly supports this theory, which could be suggestive in itself. We can look elsewhere to see what may indicate trouble from within as a possibility. The myths told by the Greeks can, as we have seen, look back into a time to explain events and changes that were taking place. Many of the myths that deal with outlining great families, such as the House of Atreus and the Royal House of Thebes, can be seen to be pointing back to the Mycenean period. These stories tend to have an element of conflict between other regions within the Mycenean world, as well as conflict within their own region. Within these myths that come down to us, the characters are usually of notable standing, and we hardly ever get a picture of the lower classes. These stories could be indicating troubles within the lower classes of society, and groups or leaders challenging the established order. The Linear B tablets reveal a tough life for the lower classes, as the Myceneans had a highly controlled society where large numbers of slaves were vital to the economy. It has been seen in many societies, tensions in lower classes and mistreatment of slaves has led to many revolts through history. Perhaps the Linear B tablets found could also provide clues, as the Doric dialect was thought to be spoken by the lower classes, and it is absent from tablets dated during the Palace period. It then becomes interesting that after the destruction periods, the Doric form of Greek becomes much more prevalent, especially in the Peloponnese. As I have said, there isn't much hard evidence to go on here, and we have to speculate, but still lends itself to serious consideration, as taking those well-defended fortified palaces throughout the regions seems like a daunting task to any invader, but they may not have been built to withstand an unexpected attack from within their own society. This could also be supported by the fact that no invasive culture can be seen in the archaeological record after these destructions. Though people are not the only reason buildings and structures can be destroyed, Mother Nature can be just as destructive, if not more so. The Aegean world was a hotbed of seismic activity, with known earthquakes occurring throughout the Greek world all through the Bronze Age to modern times. It has been suggested that a particularly large event may have led to the collapse of the Myceneans. Independent archaeological teams at Mycenae, Tiryns, and Medea have all come to the same conclusion, that a devastating earthquake had destroyed their sites around 1200 BC, with other studies indicating that a large earthquake did indeed occur in the Argolis around the same time. The teams had found that as well as the structures above ground, the foundations below were also damaged. The Great Wall that had been constructed in the region had also shown signs of buckling. It is also worth noting, even though these teams saw the damage as unmistakably caused by earthquakes, others have suggested that the damage to the foundations of the Great Wall could have been caused by decay over time from earth pressure and root pressure. Even if a great earthquake had occurred there, it still doesn't explain the Mycenaean-wide collapse, as the earthquake damage for this period seems localised to the Argolid. Another strong argument put forward has been one that generally covers the theory of climate change. It's argued that the climate was changing within the ancient world, becoming drier and hotter. This then led to a drought, which in turn would have caused crop failures across the regions, putting a massive strain on the centralised palaces meeting their requirements for the population they supported. Though there is also an argument from other scientists that it was in fact getting colder, leading to a cooler and drier climate. Whether the climate was cooling or warming up would have still most likely led to food shortages, as crops failed. This would have affected not just the Myceneans, but much further afield as well. In Egypt, evidence at Karnak indicated that measures were being taken to deal with the shortages the populations were facing, though we don't get a uniform picture across the Mediterranean world. When we look at the Linear B tablets from the final year at Pylos, there appears to be no indication of rationing when it comes to grains and cereals. As we have seen, it is very difficult to try and explain the collapse of the Mycenaean world with just a single cause, as one explanation that seems to explain one area doesn't seem to explain another's reason for destruction. Perhaps the reason, there have been many theories out there, is due to the fact that all have played some part in the final collapse of the period. Another element that may be part of the puzzle is the systems the Myceneans set their societies upon. As we have spoken about before, they highly regulated just about everything within their regions. Any sort of catastrophic event could have severely destabilised a region, which in turn may have led to another region becoming more vulnerable to events not normally encountered. Following this line of thinking, it might also suggest the palaces relied on an interlocking economy between the different regions, and maybe even different societies, which could explain why some regions fell before others. For example, the destruction of the storerooms and the stored goods during an earthquake may not have only weakened the palace struck by it, but also those regions that relied on the trade coming from that region. This could have then opened up other regions to new threats and vulnerabilities over time. We also need to keep in mind the dates for these events are difficult to pinpoint to a precise time, and certain events and evidence of destructions may have occurred a generation or two from one another. So in effect, the simultaneous destruction of the Mycenaean palaces is more likely a series of destructions over many decades, caused by multiple sources. During the same period, it wasn't only the Myceneans that were facing collapse and massive disruptions of their civilization, but many of the great Bronze Age civilisations were also suffering a similar fate. Although we haven't spoken much about the civilisations outside of the Aegean world, we're going to have a brief look at what was occurring elsewhere in places such as Egypt, Hatti, and the Levant, showing that this catastrophe wasn't just isolated to the Myceneans, but it affected the rest of the civilised world around the Mediterranean. The waves of catastrophes appear to have been the strongest in the Aegean and into Anatolia, then becoming a little more diluted the further east and south we travel. Though this isn't to say that Egypt and the civilisations in Mesopotamia weren't affected in drastic ways also. As equally as disastrous as the collapse of the Myceneans was that of the Hittites. The Hittite kingdom was centred on the city of Hattusa, located northwestern Anatolia, and at its height it encompassed the majority of modern-day Turkey, and also stretched down to the coast, roughly to where the border of modern-day Lebanon is. Once again, like the Myceneans, there is no certain way to tell why the Hittite civilization collapsed. What has been observed in the archaeological record shows that at the capital, Hattusa, the royal fortress met a violent end, as well as other public buildings in the city. Hieroglyphic texts have also revealed that there were competing power centres in the later part of Hittite history, with conflicts breaking out. It has also been suggested, due to what has been found in other regions' texts, that famine had struck the kingdom due to a series of failed crops. Due to the Hittites' decline, the cities they used to control along the Levant coast became independent, but a number right on the coast would also be destroyed. a tablet warning the city of Ugarit of attack from the sea, as well as advising other cities to fortify themselves from attack, has been discovered. The selective pattern of destruction over a period of several decades also continued further south along the coast, heading towards Egypt. The Egyptians lay most of the blame of destruction seen in Anatolia and the Levant at the feet of the Sea Peoples, who we have already briefly spoken about. Most of what we have been told about the Sea Peoples comes from the Egyptians themselves, though they have never referred to them as a single group, but have listed the areas that these people had originated from. It seems that the Sea Peoples were a result of the catastrophic events that had been taking place in the Aegean, Greek mainland, and even further west and north. Accounts referring to the attacks by the Sea Peoples can be found coming from two different rulers some 25 years apart, showing that these people were an ongoing threat and most likely occurred in waves. An overview was given by the later King Ramesses III of the events that were taking place that surely oversimplifies such complex events occurring over many decades. He describes how all at once the lands were removed and scattered in the fray. No land could stand before their arms. He then goes on to list all the regions in Anatolia that were cut off before they made camp in Amaru on the old Egyptian-Hittite border, where they desolated its people and its land was like that which had never come into being. He then describes how the Sea People came on towards Egypt, not calling them the Sea People, but a confederation of different lands, naming where they had originated from. In the inscription, 3 separate campaigns against the Sea Peoples are described, with Egypt being the victor in all of them. With the later campaigns, it can be seen that the people originally from regions in Anatolia are described as being part of the later waves. Although Egypt held out over the attacks and remained a territorial state, they had lost control of their former lands along the Levant coast. Within 100 years of the waves of refugees flooding into the Near East, Egypt's power had diminished drastically, with internal political troubles fracturing the kingdom and external contacts severely reduced. A similar picture of diminishing power and influence was taking place in Mesopotamia, with the states of Babylon, Assyria, and Elam, who were now cut off from contacts with the Levant and the Mediterranean. These states still had contact with each other, but were also often in conflict with one another, as they struggled to exert any influence beyond their borders. A change in the flow of the Euphrates River, as well as the overuse of soil, may have also led to food shortages due to the disruption of the irrigation systems. With these changes occurring, like other civilisations, internal political problems would start to plague these states as well. Finally, I wanted to just touch on the Trojan War depicted in the Iliad, since the accepted date of Homer's Troy falls right into this period of turmoil in the Bronze Age. Was the war an actual historical event, and were the Myceneans participants in the war? A couple of episodes ago, we spoke of Troy, level 7, as being the best fit for the city that was besieged and sacked during the Trojan War. What has been uncovered of this level shows that buildings were built in much more congested arrangements than before, in what seems like an attempt to cram as many inhabitants behind the city walls. Also, the remains of many weapons have also been found within the ruins, such as arrow and spearheads, as well as piles of slingshot stones. The bodies of the dead in this layer seem to be buried in a hurry and with limited real estate available for burials. The layer also shows signs of destruction through fire and is dated to have happened somewhere around 1180 BC. So far it seems Troy was preparing for and under siege for a period before the city fell somewhere around 1180. Among the tablets of the Hittite Empire, it was discovered that Troy had been involved in conflicts over a few decades during the 13th and leading into the 12th century BC. Also, in these records, a name has been pointed to which refers to the regions that the Myceneans occupied. From references with this name, the tablets then reveal to us that the Myceneans were in contact with the Hittites for at least a couple of centuries through trade and diplomacy, though they were not always on good terms, with the Myceneans having lost control of areas on the Anatolian coast to the Hittites. What is also interesting is that within a generation of 1180 BC, Troy had been deposed and the Hittite king was seeking aid in restoring the city. Though probably the most striking bit of evidence for a historical Trojan War comes from another tablet known as the Tawagalawa letter, dating to around 1250 BC, where we find a line saying, "Now as we have come to an agreement on Walasa, over which we went to war." In this, the Hittite king is referring to hostilities he and the Archaeans had over Walasa, and an agreement they had managed to come to. The Archaeans are thought to be the Bronze Age Greeks, while Walasa is thought to be the city of Troy. These names have come up in other tablets, and how they have been used has allowed historians to come to the conclusion of what they are referring to. So what we have here are references to Troy and potential conflicts which involve the city. We also see that the Myceneans were active in Anatolia with a connection to the city of Troy, with it being the centre of hostilities between the Myceneans and Hittites. There is still much unanswered when it comes to the fall of Troy. Had the Hittites waged war on them? Had the Myceneans sacked the city as suggested in the Iliad? Or had they been a part of a coalition in fighting against a despot? Or had the city of Troy fallen in much the same manner as other cities in Anatolia during the collapse of the Bronze Age? Another interesting aspect of the mystery is if the Myceneans were involved in a war against Troy, had they sacked the city before returning home, where they encountered their own downfall? Or had disaster struck the Mycenean world, and were they part of the displaced peoples moving into Anatolia? This question is still an open one, as the dating of the events in Greece and Anatolia are approximate, which makes it hard to tell which sites were destroyed first. Though what is clear is that the Greeks recall a great event that involved themselves and the city of Troy. As things stand today, it isn't possible to pinpoint an exact cause for the collapse of the Bronze Age. Even thinking that the collapse was due to one event in time is most likely far too simplistic approach to the mystery. From the evidence that is present today, it seems likely that a series of events over a few generations would ultimately lead to the failure of the systems that the Bronze Age civilisations were set upon. Natural disasters such as earthquakes and climate change may have caused food shortages. This in turn could have then seen internal strife develop, or hostile neighbours competing for reduced resources. Trade routes may then have been disrupted on a grand scale, which throughout history has been a major cause of war to develop. Economies may then have collapsed, seeing further strife within, with power vacuums needing to be filled. Opportunistic regions may also have taken advantage of declining power of a neighbour. As kingdoms fell into ruin, refugees would have taken to fleeing, seeking out safety, presenting problems to the regions they fled to. These patterns, or any combination of them, could have been developing and playing themselves out all throughout the Bronze Age world. Regions in Greece and around the Mediterranean seem to show signs of one or a couple of the events just outlined, but are inconsistent when looking at multiple areas or regions. A region may have suffered one disastrous event, but not others, though the flow-on effect could see other regions have to contend with different challenges. In the end, this sequence of events over time, and the inability of the Mycenean societies and the wider Mediterranean world to adapt and overcome the changing world around them, would see the Bronze Age come to a close. It has been seen as an end of a golden age, as certain cultural elements have been seen to have reached the height during this period. What would follow was a period where once rich, flourishing areas were depopulated. Constructions of new and repaired structures were a lesser quality, and with art and handwares being much more inferior. With this dispersal of people leading to a lower concentration of populations and the deterioration of construction and art, the archaeological record becomes much scarcer, giving us the impression of the Greek world descending into darkness. Thank you for your continued support. To receive updates and to be notified of new episodes, you can subscribe at castingthroughancientgreece.com. Also, you can follow the series on Facebook at Casting Through Ancient Greece or on Twitter at Casting Greece. I look forward to seeing you next time for episode 6, A Time of Darkness.